welcome to another episode of Down to Disness, a monthly series where I pick a Disney animated movie, talk about its history, and its impact on pop culture. This month's movie is Pinocchio, released in 1940, Disney's second animated movie ever. The story of Pinocchio was originally written by Carlo Collodi for an Italian magazine in 1881. It was later published as a novel in 1883. When Disney adapted Collodi's story, they changed a lot of things, but also kept a lot of things the same. For example, there is a cricket in Collodi's story, but Pinocchio actually smashes him with a hammer and he comes back as a ghost later in the story. Walt kept the cricket idea, but made him a personified character that helps Pinocchio on his journey to become a real boy. Jiminy actually didn't make it into the story until 9 months into production on Pinocchio, so they had to go back and rework everything and figure out how he fit in. Walt actually really wasn't happy with the first go at the story, and he scrapped hundreds of thousands of feet of footage because he wanted to rework the characters in the story to make Pinocchio more likable. In Collodi's book, Pinocchio is a mischievous and also sometimes menacing little boy. Disney had a lot of trouble figuring out ways to make him likable and have people root for him. When I think of Pinocchio in the scope of Disney animation history, I definitely think about the artistry that went into Pinocchio. More than almost any original Disney movie, Pinocchio had extremely detailed backgrounds and settings. A lot of this is due to an artist named Gustav Tenggren who worked on Pinocchio and was also an award-winning children's book author. He did all of the concept art for the towns and villages in Pinocchio and rendered the streets, did all the backgrounds. He also eventually influenced the design and layout of Disneyland, but he actually quit working on Pinocchio before the movie was released and never got credit for his work. The level of detail was so intense that they actually made real-life models of all the clocks in Geppetto's workshop, every single one, to draw it from reference. Every single one of those clocks actually existed in real life. Pinocchio also benefited from the use of Disney's famous multiplane camera, but in a different way than they used on Snow White. The multiplane camera famously allowed Disney to create new levels of depth in animated movies. So when you're going into Pinocchio's village in the very beginning of the movie, it's as if you are literally floating into a physical space. But what's different on Pinocchio is that they were able to put the camera from any position above the multiplane camera. But on Pinocchio, they found a way to enter the scene from any different vantage point that they wanted. I can't stress how much time they took to make Pinocchio extremely detailed. It wasn't just in the backgrounds, although that is what it's famous for. Think about the water in Pinocchio. They created realistic water scenes in the 40s. John Musker and Ron Clements, when they were working on Little Mermaid, went back and studied the use of water in Pinocchio because it was so good for its time that they could still learn from it in the late 80s. The scenes with Monstro and the underwater scenes before they encounter Monstro were revolutionary in animating water and set the precedent for any other water scene in animation probably up until Finding Nemo, which reestablished the standard for CGI. Unfortunately, because they were so detailed and rigorous in the animation process, Pinocchio's original budget of $500,000 was surpassed, and they ended up spending $2.5 million on the movie, which they didn't really make back until their second theatrical run. The second really significant thing about Pinocchio is the music. When You Wish Upon a Star is the penultimate Disney song. If you had to pick one song to represent the Disney company, it will be forever When You Wish Upon a Star. And maybe you don't feel that way personally about the song, but the American Film Institute ranked it as the number 7 best song in movie history, and it's the top of the list for songs in Disney animated movies. Sorry About It is the best Disney song. And fun fact, in the beginning when you hear When You Wish Upon a Star and see Jiminy Cricket singing it, to the left of the screen are 2 books behind him, one which says Peter Pan and the other Alice in Wonderland. Neither of those movies would come out for a decade or so, but Walt had already started developing the stories for feature film production. The score and the soundtrack for Pinocchio were so good that it was the first time any movie had won both Academy Awards for Best Song and Best Score. The first movie ever, animated or not. And that wouldn't happen again until 1964 with Mary Poppins, where Disney obviously won that right again. And speaking of the Academy Awards, Pinocchio was the first animated movie ever to win an Academy Award in a competitive category. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was awarded an honorary Academy Award, the famous one with the big Oscar and then the 7 little Oscars for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, for its achievement in film history for being the first animated movie ever, but it didn't actually win a competitive Academy Award, so Pinocchio holds that title for first animated feature to win a competitive Oscar. As I mentioned, they spent months struggling with how to figure out how to make Pinocchio look cute and likable. The solution turned out to be really simple, but it was Milt Kahl, famous Disney animator, who suggested they just draw him like a regular boy and then add in the nuts and bolts and joints of a puppet afterwards, which is what they ended up doing. Figaro, Geppetto's cat, actually was one of Walt Disney's favorite characters ever. He loved Figaro so much that they started introducing Figaro into Minnie Mouse shorts instead of her dachshund puppy. They were just like, no, we're gonna have Figaro be your pet instead because we love Figaro. But on the other end of the spectrum, a character that the animators didn't like was Geppetto because his voice actor, Christian Rubb, was annoying. And by annoying, I mean he was a Nazi sympathizer, and everyone on set had to constantly deal with him talking about Adolf Hitler in a positive light. But they eventually got revenge on Christian Rubb. When they were having him reference act the scene inside of Monstro's belly where he's fishing inside Monstro, they were shaking the platform that he was supposed to be on, like the raft, and they gave it quite the vigorous shake, making Christian fall a bunch of times. They all had a good laugh about it. Let's just say they were all happy to be done with him at the end of production. There's a couple other people who went on to be very famous after working on Pinocchio, one of whom is Evelyn Venable, the voice of the Blue Fairy. She is also famous for being the reference model for the opening sequence of Columbia Pictures movies. Get it? Also, famous voice actor Mel Blanc, who voiced almost all of the Looney Tunes, was in Pinocchio, kind of. Mel was originally supposed to voice the cat Gideon, but then they decided that Gideon would be a mute, and so they scrapped all of Mel's vocal recordings. Mel would not be in a Disney production until Who Framed Roger Rabbit, when he of course was voicing the Looney Tunes characters that appear in that film. While Pinocchio is a classic Disney movie to us all today, it did not succeed in its initial theatrical run because of many different war efforts going on in Europe and Asia. It affected box office sales dramatically, so it didn't make its money back until it was released again in 1945. And then it was also the first Disney movie to be released on DVD, and it was re-released in theaters about 7 times between its initial release in 1992. So, in the long run, it obviously made all of its money back and is renowned today as a Disney classic. But it's always interesting to see which Disney movies that we love today didn't do so well in their initial release. Overall, today Pinocchio is looked at as an achievement in animation artistry. It's one of the most artistically challenging Disney movies ever made, and it's given us some of the most classic, iconic Disney things in history, namely Jiminy Cricket and the song When You Wish Upon a Star. I don't know if Disney things would feel like Disney things without that song and without that character. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you learned something new about the movie Pinocchio. As always, leave in the comments below suggestions for which movie I should do on next month's Down to Disness. Happy 2016, and I'll see you guys soon for more Down to Disness. Bye!